Hi, everybody. My name is Ryker, and I am a sophomore at Boise Bible College. A lot of you have heard, you were in the circle at the beginning, but some of you haven't. So I'm a preaching major, and I don't do too awful much. I wouldn't say I'm the most interesting person. I really like music. I really like outdoor stuff and like hanging out with people. And I'm really, really excited to come and preach here today. I've been thinking about it a lot. I feel kind of bad for you guys. This is the first church that I've ever been asked to preach at, so you're the guinea pigs. Yeah, so yeah, good luck for me, I guess. But so I just wanted to also say thanks for the worship. That's great. I also, since I'm so into music, I lead a lot of worship, so I really appreciate hearing you guys lead. It's really awesome. Today, let's jump in. Our anchor text is Lamentations 3, if you brought your Bible with us. We're going to be jumping around Lamentations quite a bit, so if you can't stick with us for each part, that's totally fine. But just know that Lamentations 3 is going to be the main part of what we're talking about today. But I just wanted to start off with a bit of a story. And to be honest, I don't know if this is just an old Jewish proverb or a Jewish story, but it's told in a lot of Jewish circles. So since we're going to be talking about the Jewish people today, I thought it might be appropriate to share this one. So this is how it goes. There once was a mighty Persian king, and he went walking in his gardens one evening, and he heard a great cry, and he was immediately set upon by one of his panicked servants. "Mighty king," said the servant, "I really need your aid. I was just working in the garden like you told me to, and death came upon me, and he threatened me. And I managed to escape from him, but now I fear for my life. Will you please give me your fastest horse so that I can make it to the city of Tehran by nightfall? Because I know that Tehran is a safe place." The king considered for a moment, weighing out the good servant's years of loyal service, and eventually he conceded, and he was like, "Okay, I'll give it to you." So he gives the servant the horse and a bag of silver so that he can make it to Tehran by nightfall. So amid the sound, while the king is still in his garden, amid the sound of the servant riding off on the horse with his silver, he too came upon death. "Why have you threatened my good servant?" the king asked. And death says, "I'm really sorry. I'm confused. I didn't threaten your servant. I was just merely surprised to see him here in your gardens." And the king shook his head and he was like, "Why would you be surprised to see my servant in my gardens?" And then death smiled back and he said, "Well, I know that tonight we had an appointment to meet in Tehran." It's kind of a sad way to start off a sermon. Death and brokenness are inevitable realities in the Christian walk. No matter how hard it is that we resist, brokenness has invaded our world, and it's something that each one of us has and will experience. It's not just through death that we experience this brokenness. It's through disease and pestilence and hunger and fear and evil. You can name whatever you want when it comes to brokenness, and it sucks. It's horrible. The brokenness that we experience isn't a new thing either. We can look throughout history and see at every turn there's some kind of brokenness that's being expressed. Through World War II, World War I, the Crusades, the rising and falling of these evil empires, whatever it is, that brokenness is something that's not foreign to us, and it's also something that wasn't foreign to the biblical authors either. The Bible is filled with stories that break the hearts of its authors. The making of the Bible wasn't made by men who are sitting and drinking tea on sunny afternoons. It was actually written by people who were deeply troubled and deeply hurt. It was written from prison cells. It was written in the midst of oppressive empires. It was written in the company of death and bloodshed of people that they loved. The Bible is not an account of what should have happened. The Bible is an account of what did happen. It's an honest expression of human suffering in a world that we ourselves have chosen to destroy. It's the inspired and infallible word of God, but it's simultaneously an expression of sadness and pain. Even though there are some and most spots that spark joy, and the message of the Bible sparks joy in our hearts, but in reality, brokenness works through the cracks. And one of the authors who really, I think, understood brokenness better than most was the author Jeremiah. His nickname was the Weeping Prophet, if it gives you any hints. He wrote this really small book that packs a really big punch. He actually wrote two. One of them's not small. One of them's Jeremiah, and it's huge. But the other one is Lamentations. It's a book that's lesser known, and it has an incredible impact on the idea of brokenness and grief. And that's exactly what I have the pleasure to talk to you about is grief. Yeah, grief. It's a very timely sermon. But it's not just grief, faith-filled grief that we find in Lamentations. So before we start talking about grief in Lamentations, it would be good for us to get a little bit of background information, to be able to understand where the book is coming from. So the Book of Lamentations is a Hebrew poem. It's actually 5 Hebrew poems made up into one poem. And it's written during the Babylonian exile of Jerusalem. So Babylon comes in and wipes everything out. And you can read about it in 2 Kings 24 and 25. But I just want to give you a little bit of a taste. So this is from 2 Kings 25. And it says this: "But the Babylonian army pursued the king and overtook him in the plains of Jericho. All his soldiers were separated from him and scattered, and he was captured. He was taken to the king of Babylon at Riblah, where sentence was pronounced on him. They killed the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes. Then they ripped out his eyes, bound him with bronze shackles, and took him to Babylon. On the 7th day of the 5th month, in the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, commander of the imperial guard, an official of the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. He set fire to the temple of the Lord and the royal palace and all the houses in Jerusalem. Every important building he burned down. The whole Babylonian army, under the commander of the imperial guard, broke down the walls around Jerusalem. Nebuzaradan carried into exile the people who remained in the city, along with the rest of the populace and those who had deserted to the king of Babylon. But the commander left behind some of the poorest people in the land to work the vineyards and the fields." The Book of Lamentations is written during that last part of the people who were left behind. It was written during the exile and after. To really be able to understand the severity of the exile, it's important to read what the authors wrote about it and try to imagine it for ourselves. This was a time of severe, severe pain and suffering for the Jewish people, when everyone they loved, everything that they knew, it was all ripped away from them. And Jeremiah was one of the unlucky souls who experienced this and was left behind in Jerusalem for a time being. And Lamentations goes really into extreme depth about how awful the situation was and just how the people felt in light of it. Most of this 5-chapter book, it's like this poetic expression of the bitter, bitter grief that's felt by Jerusalem and its inhabitants. The grief shows up in almost every possible point in the book. And Jeremiah makes it a point to show just how miserable life is after the exile. Lamentations isn't a book about complaining about the harsh consequences of sin. It's actually just a book about venting and grieving about the consequences of your sin in God's judgment. This is a key thing to understand about the book, this is going to really, it messes with my theology. The exile happened not out of chance, not out of Israel's economic inferiority, not out of military strength. The exile happened because God was punishing Israel. He was punishing them for ignoring the poor, for worshiping false idols, for adultery, for slandering their neighbors, for slaughtering people, and for killing their children in fire. People often assume that the destruction of Jerusalem, and really sin in general, it's like done by an angry God for no reason. If you get outside of the Christian bubble, you'll see people using this justification pretty often. But the sad thing is that's really not the whole picture at all. Consequence, judgment is really done by a God who's not just angry, but heartbroken, and is punishing a wayward people for their sins. After all, Lamentations and Ezekiel, they both talk about how God doesn't desire and doesn't delight in the death of the wicked. It breaks his heart. Lamentations is a documentation of how man feels in receiving that harsh judgment from God. And naturally, that feeling is grief and sorrow and lament. So after all that background info, we should probably get into the meat of the book. So Lamentations, like I said, is one poem that's made up of 5 smaller Hebrew poems. Each chapter laments the destruction of Israel in different ways. But there's one consistent vein that throws throughout the entire book, which is just bitter grief. There is not one chapter that lacks a deep emphasis on grief. Grief both personally, nationally, and spiritually for your nation. So, chapter 1, finally get into this a little bit. Chapter 1 opens with a statement of lament and pain regarding Israel's situation. Israel is actually personified as a lonely woman who's been left all by herself. And this is how the book opens. So, yeah, it's great. How deserted lies the city, once so full of people. How like a widow is she, who once was great among the nations. She who was queen among the provinces has now become a slave. Bitterly she weeps at night. Tears are upon her cheeks. Among all her lovers, there is none to comfort her. All her friends have betrayed her. They have become her enemies. The first statement of the book regards this deep grief for the situation that Israel finds itself in. They're left alone and bitterly weeping over the pain that they themselves have caused. That same sentiment is found at every turn in the book. Everywhere that you read, you're going to find this. It's not just the beginning or the end, but every word is coded in pain. It was written by an author with a clenched jaw and tear-stained paper. The bitter conditions and the deplorable situation is lamented over in one of the most hardcore and sad verses in the whole book, and it's in chapter 4, verse 10, and it says, "With their own hands, compassionate women have cooked their own children, who have become food for my people who were destroyed." It's a disgusting reality that Israel has found themselves in, and it's a disgusting reality that they are grieving. So why is it that Jerusalem is experiencing such an awful circumstance? Isn't it unfair that they have been placed in such a hard situation when really what they could have done, it couldn't have been that bad? Where is God in their suffering and their grief? This is one of the first things that I really want to touch on today. It would be wrong for us to read Lamentations assuming that the suffering of Jerusalem was done without God's consent and it happened through chance. In reality, this is the thing that messes with our theology. It is God who chose to punish Israel in this way. God brought in the exile. That'll mess with your theology. Jerusalem has been destroyed because of their sins. In chapter 1, verse 5, it reads, "Her foes have become her masters. Her enemies are at ease. The Lord has brought her grief because of her many sins. Her children have gone into exile, captive before the foes." And in 2:14, it says, "The visions of your prophets were false and worthless. They did not expose your sin to ward off your captivity. The prophecies they gave you were false, and they were misleading." This makes it painfully clear that because Israel had become engulfed in their sins, they had to be punished by God. God's covenant with them was really simple. If you want to go all the way back to Deuteronomy chapter 28, it's going to talk about when they enter the promised land, God says, if you follow me, you will be blessed. And if you don't, you will be cursed. It's that simple. And this is the consequence of their curse. Israel had forsaken the law of the Lord in so many ways, like adultery, worshiping other gods, child sacrifice. To put it simply, Jerusalem was destroyed because God was punishing them for their sins. Their destruction was simply an expression of God's justice. It would actually have been unjust for God to not punish these people. But what exactly is the punishment? I know that it has to do with the exile. I've been talking about it a lot, but God's punishment is deeper than that. It is severe and it is horrible. Listen to what Jeremiah says in chapter 2, verses 3 through 5. It says this: "In fierce anger, he has cut off every horn of Israel. He has withdrawn his right hand at the approach of the enemy. He is burned in Jacob like a flaming fire that consumes everything around it. Like an enemy, he has strung his bow. His right hand is ready. Like a foe, he has slain all who were pleasing to the eye. He has poured out his wrath like fire on the tent of the daughter of Zion. The Lord is like an enemy. He has swallowed up Israel. He has swallowed up all her palaces and destroyed her strongholds. He has multiplied mourning and lamentation for the daughter of Zion." The consequences of Israel's sin are massive. They're all-encompassing, and they devastate the entire land and every person. No one was left untouched, and no one was left unaffected by this sweep of God's wrath. In this chunk of scripture that we just read, there's one key theme that unites it all, and it's that God is Judah's enemy. The consequences to sin are not just physical destruction, but the pain, the real pain, of knowing that the one who loves you more than anything has turned to be your greatest enemy. So, This is the painful consequence to the sin that Jerusalem has caused. That what is supposed to be their greatest love has turned to be their greatest enemy. In this instance, the natural reaction is to grieve. If you don't grieve over that, there's something in the heart that is wrong. Not only is it natural, but it's the healthiest possible reaction that we can have to making God our enemy. Just like what we've talked about so much in detail, Israel grieves in an intense and a bitter way, but although they may be mourning, the author of Lamentations, Jeremiah, knows that mourning is healthy and a real response to the folly that Judah has found themselves in. And there's a little bit deeper layer here. And this is really where I think we can start to see ourselves in this book. We can see our own experiences in the bitterness of grief, yes. We've all grieved. But we can also see ourselves in Jeremiah's shoes when he, in the only happy part of the book, looks upon God as his rescuer. See, there's only one spot in the entire verse, it's 8 verses long, that offers any kind of hope, and it's right in the middle of the book. Hebrew poetry likes to do this thing. It's really foreign to the American mind. In American literature and movies, whatever it is, we have the main point that starts at the top, and then everything else comes after it. Or we have the main point at the very end, and everything leads up to it. So these are the two options that America has, right? Well, that's not what the biblical authors thought. In Hebrew poetry, they actually put the most important idea oftentimes right in the middle, and they form everything else around that idea. And Lamentations is no different. So, in the midst of Jeremiah's most bitter anguish and bitter pain, in the middle of it, he says these words in chapter 3, verse 21. Yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion, therefore I will wait for him. The Lord is good to those whose hope is in him, to those who seek him. It is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for a man to bear the yoke while he is young. Wow. What profound words. Imagine in the time of your most distressing pain and your most bitter grief, that the words that come from your mouth are great are your faithfulness, or great are your compassions, or your mercies, they're new every morning. Your love is all-encompassing. What a crazy statement. That was what Jeremiah wrote as he was looking at all of his dead friends in the street. And it should be our reality as well, this hope. In that inevitable feeling of grief and lament that we all feel and will feel, God has not forsaken, and he has not forgotten us completely. Grief it's such a real piece of our lives, and it's really easy to forget God in those moments. But that seems to be the opposite of what we're supposed to do. Here's the deal. This is the main point. Faith-filled grief is trusting and hoping in the character of God to redeem the brokenness in our world, in our situations, and in our own hearts. While grief is normal and it is healthy, the follower of Jesus must never forget that God's character is what drives us to hope. It's what drives us to yearn, and it is what drives us to live. The hope for the Christian lies not in just the perfection of all things, rather it's really in the one who perfects them. It lies in the character of God. Having faith through our grief is not shown just in trusting God to fix all of our situations, it's just in trusting God. Period. In his character, in his love, and his faithfulness, his compassion, and his mercy. In Jeremiah's most bitter time of grief and his most bitter time of anguish, he trusted that God was loving and still cared for his people deeply. And we are no different. In our times of grief, God remains loving, and God remains faithful, and he still remains compassionate. So let me say again that faith-filled grief is trusting and hoping in the character of God to redeem. Our hope is not just in the redemption of all things, it is rather in the one who redeems them. So I want to tell a story really quick that I think is pretty applicable here. Near the end of World War II, there was an Austrian Jew, he was a psychiatrist, his name was Viktor Frankel. He was taken to Auschwitz and Dachau, and he was treated just like all the other patients there. He wrote a very, very famous book. Some of you may have heard of it. It's called Man's Search for Meaning. It's about, quote unquote, it's about psychiatry, but it's not about psychiatry. You need to read it if you haven't read it. Man's Search for Meaning. It's great. When Frankel arrived, he was a pretty successful middle-aged doctor. And as everyone else in the Holocaust did, he was treated horribly. He was frozen half to death. He didn't eat at all. He was beaten. He was worked literally to the bone. His entire family was slaughtered. And he was left alone to fight for survival in the camps. I can't think of any situation that brings about more grief. I think that we can all agree when we think of grieving, like worldly grieving situations, we can all take different situations and stuff, different historical events, but we can all agree that the Holocaust is one that presents this grief in an awful way. And while he was in the camp, he was on this work crew, but he had the opportunity to start working as a doctor in the typhus wards. So he takes the job because it's something that he's comfortable with. And while he's there working, he was speaking to one of his patients, and he was in really good health. The patient was on the typhus ward, so I mean, how good of health can you be in the Holocaust with typhus? But compared to everyone else, he was doing quite well. He has this meeting with him, and the patient says, Dr. Frankel, I have something to tell you. And Frankel goes, what is it? And he's like, I had a dream last night. This is in February. He says, I had a dream last night, and a voice in the dream told me that my liberation is coming. And he was like, what do you mean by that? And he was like, March 30th. Liberation is coming. The troops are going to march in, and they're going to release all of us. So Frankel says, okay, well, that's pretty cool. And he thinks this is actually a really good time to conduct some experiments. So he takes his temperature. It's completely normal. March 30th comes. No liberation. And he takes his temperature again, and it's spiked at 104 degrees. And the next day he was dead. Frankel says this, those who know how close the connection is between the state of mind of a man and the state of immunity of his body will understand that the sudden loss of hope and courage can have a deadly effect. The ultimate cause of my friend's death was that the expected liberation did not come, and he was severely disappointed. This suddenly lowered his body's resistance against the latent typhus infection. His faith in the future and his will to live had become paralyzed by his grief. Frankel's message in the book is that hope is what drives people through their hard times. The people who survived in the camps, this is very interesting, the people who survived in the camps were not the strongest and they were not the smartest. It was in the baker who just wanted to bake again. They were the people who survived. It was in the painter who longed to paint one more time. And it was in the writer who just wanted to keep writing. But the people who placed their hope in that which can be taken from them died very quickly in the harsh conditions. The mothers who longed for their families died immediately because they knew that their families had died as well. The husbands who wanted to see their wives died very quickly because that's what their hope was placed in, and it had all gone away. People who hoped in things that can be taken from them died very early because their hope was in material things. But those who hoped in what cannot be taken from them lived. And the same is true for our Christian walk. Our hope is in Jesus to redeem the brokenness that we experience in this world. Sorrow and grief are detrimental to the human heart, literally and figuratively. But the thing that carries us through our grief is hope in something. And it is just hope in Jesus as our Redeemer, that which cannot be taken. So let's finish up by looking at the very end of the book. The book ends on a note that you probably wouldn't expect. Chapter 5, verses 19 through 22. They're really interesting. And it starts off reading as if we're going to end on a really triumphal, great note. And this is verse 19 through 22. This is what Jeremiah says. You, O Lord, reign forever. Your throne endures from generation to generation. Let's end there. No, we can't end there. There's more, unfortunately. Why do you always forget us? Why do you forsake us for so long? Restore us to yourself, O Lord, that we may return. Renew our days as of old, unless you have utterly rejected us and are angry with us beyond measure. Such an odd ending. It's like ... Where's the rest of it? Where's the hope? We expect hope at the end. why does he end on such a negative note? By ending the book on such a negative note, it actually presents exactly the point that Jeremiah has been trying to make this entire book. And it's that God invades each of our circumstances, no matter how we feel or how doubtful that we are. The perspective of Jeremiah sounds like there's no hope present, but I just want to tell you that is not the point. That's not what he's writing. The whole point of the book is to lament miserable situations of consequence while also having faith in God's character to bring them through it. In this grim final verse, unless you have utterly rejected us and are angry with us beyond measure, there is in fact hope. Because we cannot forget that no matter how we feel and no matter what we are thinking, the truth of chapter 3, that God is our Redeemer, remains through the rest of it. That God is faithful and his mercies are new every morning. He is faithful. The thing that offers comfort in Lamentations is not the faithfulness of man being rewarded by God. It's the faithfulness of God despite man. In the bitterly depressing book of Lamentations, it ends on a note of unrest and unresolved emotional distress. And while the book itself doesn't end on a hopeful note, we must always remember that our circumstances are not what matter in the end. The only thing that matters is the character of God. So when we feel like Jeremiah did at the end of Lamentations, let's be honest with God, because it's healthy to lament. But let us never forget that in our times of grief, we should focus on the one thing that can bring hope, which is the character and the love of God. So let's pray. Lord, this is an unprecedented time in history where we are grieving as a country. It's such a weird time that it's bringing about such odd emotions and so much grief and pain. But I pray that the promises in Lamentation ring true in all of our hearts, that we rely on your character and your love and your peace to drive us through this, that we do not have faith in just the redemption of all things, although we love that. We really just have faith in you. It is not us who do anything good. It is only you. It is only by your love that we can do anything, Lord. So we love you so, so much. And I thank you for this church being that beacon of light that can offer hope to a grieving people of the world. And it's in your precious name, Jesus, that I pray. Amen.